Hey guys, tonight we begin our strange wander through the fog-soaked alleys of Victorian medicine. You picture yourself stepping onto a cobbled London street, gaslight flickering through the smog, horses clopping past with carts piled high, and just around the corner, a doctor fumbling with a jar of leeches as though he were carrying a trendy handbag. Yes, this is medicine, circa the 19th century, and you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, tell me in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice as you drift into this world is how medicine feels less like science and more like a performance art. A doctor strides into a sick room carrying leather bags, polished instruments, and yes, tucked under his arm, a glass jar filled with leeches wriggling like an inky soup. To the Victorian mind, this jar is not grotesque, it is reassuring, like today's white lab coat. You think of the doctor's patients, pale as parchment, rolling up their sleeves while trying not to stare at the little creatures about to feast. Bloodletting had been around for centuries, but in the Victorian age it was still considered sophisticated. The idea was simple. Illness was caused by imbalance, and if you let some blood out, balance might be restored. Historians still argue whether practitioners truly believed in the theory, or whether it had simply become medical theatre, performed more for the comfort of patients than for any real effect. But regardless of the reasoning, the practice endured far longer than you'd expect, sometimes into the late 1800s, long after germ theory was beginning to make sense of disease. Leeches weren't the only tool. You walk past an apothecary shop and catch a glimpse of a wooden box labelled cupping set. Cupping, involving heated glass domes placed on the skin to create suction, left circular bruises that Victorian patients wore like medals of survival. Imagine proudly showing off your bruises to friends and saying, "Look, I'm healing." The irony is that, in many cases, people were simply bruised and still sick. You might picture one of these doctors visiting a wealthy home. He leans in close to examine the patient, then asks for a basin of warm water. He carefully tips the jar and, with a practiced flick, places a leech on the patient's neck. The tiny mouth fastens, and within minutes, blood flows. You can almost hear the slurping. It's gross, but the Victorians saw it as cutting edge. Quirky tidbit. Leeches were so popular that pharmacies often had leech tanks out front, like aquariums of slow-moving black ribbons. In big cities, shortages were common. London alone reportedly imported millions of leeches each year. Somewhere in France, farmers even raised them like livestock, herding them in ponds. That's right, you could have a leech farm. Imagine explaining that at dinner. Oh yes, I tend to my flock of bloodsuckers. But the Victorian street wasn't all jars and livestock. As you trudge deeper into the city fog, you notice how fragile everything feels. The smog burns your throat, a mix of coal smoke and damp air. Children cough in the shadows. Doctors' bags clink with glass vials of mysterious powders, liquids, and yes, more leeches. Because you never know when a second or third round of bloodletting might be required. And here's where the reality check comes in. If you caught pneumonia in 1850, your odds weren't great. With antibiotics still decades away, you were left with whatever your local doctor had at hand. A leech, a blistering plaster, maybe a spoonful of opium syrup. You probably won't survive this, no matter how much faith you put in the jar of wrigglers. But there's also a certain beauty in the strangeness. The gaslight reflects off the jar, creating rippling patterns on the doctor's coat. The horse snorts as it passes, its breath rising like smoke. Somewhere, a child giggles nervously as the doctor assures them that the leech will only tickle. And you, drifting through this dreamlike scene, realize that medicine was less about science and more about belief, ritual, and a dash of Victorian showmanship. What historians still debate is how much patients truly trusted these rituals. Were they reassured by the doctor's confident gestures, or did they secretly doubt that a jar of leeches could fix a failing lung? Diaries suggest both. Some patients wrote of miraculous recoveries, while others complained that treatment left them weaker than before. But the theatre continued, because when you have few answers, you cling to the rituals that feel like answers. You shuffle along, fog curling around your ankles. Ahead, another doctor appears, this one balancing a lantern and a bag of cupping glasses. He looks tired, his boots spattered with mud, his eyes shadowed from endless house calls. Yet he walks with purpose, because in the absence of antibiotics, vaccines, and proper surgical hygiene, these rituals are all he has to offer, and you, half amused and half horrified, watch as medicine marches forward on tiny wriggling feet. Maybe, just maybe, you feel a whisper of gratitude for your own century. No one prescribes you a leech anymore, unless it's in very specific, very modern microsurgery. But in the dark streets of Victorian England, jars clink, blood drips, and patients sigh, hoping that the little black creatures will sip away their sickness. You shuffle onward through the gaslit haze, and suddenly the smell changes. It's sharper, sweeter, almost cloying, like spiced syrup left too long on the stove. You follow the scent until you spot a little wooden sign swinging above a doorway. Apothecary. Inside, shelves sag under brown bottles with ornate labels. Tincture of laudanum, elixir of morphia, Dover's powders. And here's the unsettling truth. Every one of these bottles contains opium, freely available, sold to mothers, businessmen, and even children without so much as a raised eyebrow. Victorian England adored laudanum. Imagine brandy mixed with powdered opium and maybe a dash of saffron or cinnamon if the pharmacist was feeling fancy. It was the 19th century catch-all solution. Can't sleep. Take laudanum. Stomach hurts. Laudanum. Child teething. Pour a spoonful straight down their little throat and watch them drift off like a tiny Victorian cloud. Yes, babies were being dosed with what today would count as a heavy narcotic. You probably wouldn't survive this either, though at least you'd nap peacefully. The reality is staggering. Laudanum was cheaper than beer in some towns. Families kept it on the mantel like we keep ibuprofen, and doctors scribbled it on prescriptions with cheerful confidence. Historians still argue whether Victorian physicians genuinely understood the addictive potential, or if they quietly looked the other way, knowing it was the only thing that actually dulled pain. Either way, by the 1870s, entire households were dependent. Picture yourself stepping inside that apothecary shop. The pharmacist, with his neat whiskers and ink-stained fingers, leans over the counter. He offers a dose in a glass vial wrapped in paper, just enough to settle your nerves. Beside you, a weary mother jostles her fussy infant, accepting a bottle labelled Godfrey's Cordial, nicknamed Mother's Little Helper, a syrupy mixture of treacle, opium, and spices. The baby soon quiets, but the silence has a shadow to it. Mainstream fact, some of England's greatest minds were hooked. Writers like Thomas de Quincey and Samuel Taylor Coleridge openly wrestled with laudanum addictions. De Quincey even wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater, detailing the vivid dreams and horrific withdrawals of Victorian opium life. But far from being a scandal, his book became fashionable reading, as though addiction were just another intellectual quirk. Meanwhile, quirky tidbits litter the story. One travelling quack advertised opium-laced caramels for nervous young ladies. Another sold soothing syrups for coughs, which were basically morphine with sugar. If you imagine Victorians strolling through foggy parks high on what amounts to liquid heroin, you're not far off. The city itself seems dreamlike under the haze of narcotics. Gas lamps glow orange, faces look blurred and waxy, and you feel as if half the population is floating through a slightly altered reality. Diaries describe how families measured out teaspoons of laudanum as casually as we pour tea. Children grew up accustomed to its bitter taste, and doctors, burdened with few real cures, leaned on it as their most reliable ally, even if it dulled symptoms rather than fixing disease. As you drift through the story, you sense how medicine and recreation blurred. A gentleman with a sore back might dose himself medicinally before heading to the theatre, just to make the evening more pleasant. Ladies, too, were prescribed laudanum for hysteria, female troubles, or simply melancholy. Vague diagnoses that probably just meant they were human beings with emotions. And because Victorian society frowned on open drinking for women, a discreet sip of laudanum-laced cordial was considered perfectly respectable. You pause at the edge of a cramped boarding house. Through the window you see a pale figure lying in bed, a small glass bottle on the table, candlelight flickering beside it. The person sighs with relief, half dreaming, half fading. You wonder, is this healing? Or is it just drifting toward dependency? Historians still argue whether laudanum preserved lives by easing suffering, or shortened them by masking symptoms until it was too late. Probably both. Yet, amid the haze, there's a strange tenderness. Imagine a mother humming as her baby finally falls quiet, or a miner sighing as the burning in his chest subsides for the night. These were moments of genuine comfort, even if the cure carried its own poison. Medicine here isn't neat or clinical, it's messy, flawed, and human. And if you were to linger too long in that apothecary, you'd notice how the pharmacist's hands shake just slightly as he measures out the drops. Maybe he uses the same mixture himself after long hours. Maybe the line between healer and addict has already blurred. You realise that the Victorian world ran not just on coal and steam, but on opium syrup, seeping quietly into every corner of daily life. You step back into the fog, your head still buzzing from the sweet-sour scent of laudanum, and you stumble into a small shop glowing with strange blue sparks. The sign reads, "Electrical apparatus and restorative devices." Inside, the shelves are stacked not with medicine bottles, but with belts, rods, coils of copper wire, and curious contraptions that look part medical tool, part steampunk costume piece. This is where Victorians came when they believed electricity could cure just about anything. Electricity was brand new magic in the 19th century. You think about how today we plug in our phones or complain when Wi-Fi lags, but in Victorian England, a flicker of current felt like touching the divine. They were convinced it carried life force, maybe even the key to immortality. So of course, doctors and salesmen decided to harness it, not for light bulbs, but for aching joints, drooping moods, and, of course, the eternal concern, male vitality. One particularly popular device was the electric belt. Imagine a stiff leather strap studded with bits of copper and tiny wires. Men were told to wear it under their trousers to restore energy, cure nervous exhaustion, and, let's be honest, keep things lively in the bedroom. The ads promised results so miraculous that you wonder if the belt was more marketing than medicine. Historians still argue whether any of these devices delivered more than a faint tingle, or if it was pure Victorian placebo dressed up in sparks. But there were real experiments happening too. Hospitals kept electrotherapy rooms where patients sat while doctors cranked handles on induction machines. The faint buzz travelled through wires into pads pressed against the skin. Patients reported tingling, muscle twitching, sometimes a shocking jolt that made them yelp. For paralysis or depression, doctors swore by it. And if you complained of vague fatigue, well, they'd hook you up to see if a little lightning might perk you up. Quirky detail? There was actually a Victorian electric hairbrush. Yes, a brush wired to deliver tiny shocks to the scalp, advertised as a guaranteed cure for baldness. Picture a balding gentleman in a waistcoat grimacing as he drags it across his head. Sparks popping like fireflies. Did it regrow hair? Spoiler, no. But it made people feel they were doing something scientific. You wander farther into the shop and notice shelves of galvanic jewellery. Bracelets and necklaces with little embedded batteries were sold to improve circulation and ward off rheumatism. Imagine walking into a parlour, your host's necklace buzzing faintly against their collarbone, and everyone pretending this was sophisticated rather than slightly alarming. The atmosphere of these sessions feels half laboratory, half parlour game. Guests gather around a machine, taking turns holding the metal rods while someone cranks up the current. People squeal, laugh, and then nod solemnly, claiming they feel their health improving. Electricity becomes both medicine and entertainment. Mainstream fact, electrotherapy wasn't entirely nonsense. By the late 19th century, scientists like Michael Faraday and Luigi Galvani had proven electricity could stimulate muscles and nerves. This is the groundwork for technologies we still use today, from defibrillators to nerve stimulators. But in Victorian times, the science blurred with spectacle, and the treatments often looked more like carnival acts than controlled experiments. And let's not skip the strangest of them all, the electric vibrator. Yes, the Victorians invented one, marketed as a medical device to treat female hysteria. Doctors claimed that by using a vibrating machine, they could restore balance to a woman's nervous system. It was clinical language for what was essentially a mechanical shortcut to relief. You can almost hear the polite coughs and rustling skirts in the doctor's office as the machine buzzed to life. Historians still debate whether most doctors genuinely believed in the medical reasoning or simply leaned into a socially acceptable loophole. Either way, it's one of those moments where Victorian medicine straddled the line between prudishness and unintentional candour. As you drift out of the shop, sparks snap behind you. You picture men in stiff collars strapping on electric belts under their waistcoats, women clutching galvanic bracelets, and whole families gathered around a crank machine like it's both a cure and a party trick. The city outside still reeks of coal and horse dung, but inside people believe they are buzzing with the future. You walk on, amused and slightly wary. If the laudanum haze dulled Victorian senses, electricity jolted them awake, at least until the batteries ran out. And so medicine in this era veered wildly between dreamy sedation and jolting sparks, never quite finding balance, but always putting on a spectacular show. The fog drifts heavier now, and as you wander away from the electric crackle of those Victorian contraptions, you find yourself pausing in front of a tailor's window. But this isn't any ordinary display of waistcoats and gowns. Instead, the mannequins are cinched tight, their torsos laced in like hourglasses, ribs pressed inward until you wonder how anyone could breathe at all. Welcome to Victorian fashion, not just clothing, but medicine, or so people believed. Corsets were everywhere. They weren't optional accessories. They were daily uniforms worn from girlhood into adulthood. You picture a young woman standing still as her maid yanks the laces tight. Her waist shrinks, her back straightens, her lungs compress. She gasps, but the mirror reflects a shape society admired. To Victorians, that hourglass silhouette wasn't merely attractive, it was healthy. They thought a corset provided posture, supported delicate female bodies, and even prevented internal organs from wandering about aimlessly. Historians still argue whether corsets were genuinely harmful to most wearers, or whether modern critics exaggerate the dangers. Still, some stories are difficult to dismiss. Doctors reported patients fainting at balls, collapsing mid-dance because their corsets left no room for a deep breath. Ribs could be deformed if worn too tightly for too long, and digestion certainly didn't thank you for the constant squeeze. Imagine sitting through an 8-course Victorian dinner with your stomach stuffed inside a steel cage. It makes Thanksgiving pants feel forgiving. And then there were the extremes. Rib removal surgeries. Yes, some desperate individuals, particularly in the late century, underwent dangerous operations to remove floating ribs, all in pursuit of that impossible waistline. Without anesthesia until the mid-1800s and without sterile technique until later, you can imagine the risks. Yet vanity and the belief that beauty equaled health drove people under the knife. Quirky tidbit: men weren't immune. Military officers sometimes wore corsets for posture, claiming it improved bearing on the parade ground. Dandies and fashionable gentlemen had their waists cinched too, hoping to present a trim, athletic silhouette. Picture a drawing room where both husband and wife are tugging at their corset laces, silently praying not to faint during tea. But fashion medicine didn't end at corsets. Tight collars for men, called choker collars, were so stiff they could cut circulation to the brain. Doctors even coined a term, collar death, for men found slumped at their desks with strangled necks. Their stylish attire quite literally killing them. Victorian style sometimes doubled as its own hazard warning label. Yet the cultural belief ran deep. Good posture and tight lacing were thought to prevent tuberculosis by keeping the lungs elevated. Of course, this was nonsense, but when disease stalked every household, people clung to anything that sounded plausible. Mainstream medicine often supported these ideas. Doctors wrote guides suggesting how many hours per day a corset should be worn for maximum health benefit. As you imagine strolling through Hyde Park, you see rows of ladies on promenade, skirts billowing, corsets hidden but shaping every breath. Parasols tilt. Voices flutter politely, but beneath the surface, lungs ache and ribs press tight. Some diaries reveal how women quietly loosen their laces once at home, sighing in relief. The public image was discipline and health. The private reality was discomfort, sometimes illness. Historians still debate whether corsetry was entirely oppressive, or if many women found it empowering, a way to wield beauty as social currency. After all, not everyone fainted daily. Some managed well, adapting to the constant squeeze like modern people adapt to high heels. The truth probably sits in between, a mix of genuine harm, exaggerated myths, and cultural expectations strong enough to bind tighter than any lace. And fashion experiments went even stranger. Health shoes, with bizarre arch supports, magnets sewn into undergarments to draw away disease, and even posture braces that made the wearer resemble a human marionette. The Victorian body was a battlefield, shaped by fabric and metal as much as by medicine. You pass a tailor's assistant carrying a corset box down the street, the lid stamped with gilt letters, Madame So-and-so's patent corset, endorsed by leading physicians. It's medicine sold through fashion, or fashion disguised as medicine. Either way, the wearer pays the price in breath, bone, and endurance. As the fog curls around, you realise this isn't just clothing, it's a philosophy. The Victorians thought they could sculpt health the way they sculpted silhouettes. And so, medicine stretched its definition, from jars of leeches to ribbons of silk, each promising balance, beauty, and survival in a world that offered very little certainty. The street grows quieter now, and as you drift along, the gaslight fades into the iron shadow of an enormous building. Its windows are barred, the gates heavy, the walls looming like a fortress. A brass plaque reads, "County Asylum for the Insane," and you realise you've stepped into another Victorian medical experiment, this time not with jars or corsets, but with minds. Victorian society was obsessed with categorising madness. What counted as insane could be anything from violent delusions to mild depression, to a woman disagreeing with her husband too often. Yes, that really happened. Families brought relatives to asylums not always out of cruelty, but often out of desperation. And once the gates closed, life inside became its own strange mixture of care, confinement, and questionable science. You picture yourself walking the echoing corridors. The air smells of lime wash and damp stone. In one ward, patients sit silently in rows, heads bent, knitting or shelling peas under supervision. In another, You hear shouting and the rattle of chains being shaken. The reformers claimed those restraints were becoming rare. Historians still argue whether Victorian asylums were havens of compassion or prisons of neglect. The truth, predictably, is both. Mainstream fact: the early 19th century saw the rise of the moral treatment philosophy. Instead of beating or chaining patients, doctors promoted structured days, clean environments, and gentle encouragement toward routine. The Quakers' York Retreat was famous for this approach, and many Victorian asylums copied its model. For some, it worked. Quiet gardens, daily walks, and orderly meals provided stability where chaos once ruled. But quirkiness slipped in too. Some doctors believed ice baths could shock madness out of patients, dunking them suddenly into freezing water. Others used spinning chairs, literally strapping patients in and rotating them at dizzying speeds to rebalance the brain. You imagine the helpless whirling, skirts flying, shoes dropping, and you realise it looks less like therapy and more like a Victorian carnival ride gone wrong. As you pass through one ward, you notice patients lying still, covered in cold compresses of vinegar-soaked cloths. The doctor explains this is to cool overheated brains. Next door, a nurse cranks an organ, playing hymns as patients shuffle to the tune. Music therapy, they called it, a gentler attempt at calming frayed minds. The buildings themselves reflected medical philosophy. Many were built in bat-wing designs, long arms extending from a central hub, allowing sunlight and fresh air to reach most wards. The idea was that architecture itself could heal, order imposed on disorder. But behind the tidy symmetry, overcrowding soon undid the plan. By the mid-Victorian era, asylums meant for 500 often held over 1,000. Privacy vanished. Voices echoed. Hope thinned. You stop at the doorway to a women's ward. A nurse ushers you aside as she carries in a tray of sedatives, opium, of course, and sometimes bromide. Patients receive doses that keep them docile. In another corner, a doctor peers over notes, trying to classify symptoms into neat categories: mania, melancholia, hysteria. He believes he's building a science of the mind. You know he's laying groundwork for psychiatry, but you also see the futility of labelling every human sadness as pathology. Quirky tidbit: one asylum ran a cricket team, fielding patients against local villages. Reports describe men in striped uniforms batting with unexpected skill, though their medical notes still listed them as incurables. Another institution staged plays and concerts, inviting the public, blurring the line between hospital and theatre. It was medicine a spectacle once again, only now the performers were the patients themselves. And always, outside the walls, families wondered, would their loved ones ever return? Sometimes they did, after months of rest and care. Patients were discharged, their symptoms eased, but many never left. Asylums quietly became warehouses for society's misfits, from epileptics to alcoholics, to simply the inconveniently eccentric. Historians still argue whether Victorians locked people away out of compassion or out of fear. Perhaps it was both, depending on whose door you knocked on. You continue down the hall and step into the asylum garden. Despite the chill, rows of patients dig in the soil, guided by attendants. The theory was that fresh air and honest labour could heal troubled minds. Some look calm, others distracted, a few muttering softly to themselves. Birds flutter in the bare trees. For a moment, the scene almost feels peaceful. And as the gate swings shut behind you, you can't quite decide what lingers more, the faint hope of moral treatment or the clanging echo of restraint and overcrowding. The asylum, like so much of Victorian medicine, is a place of contradiction, half healing, half harm, and wholly unsettling. You leave the asylum behind, its iron gate still creaking in your ears, and step back into the fog-drenched street. A new sound reaches you now. The clink of metal basins, the soft drip of liquid, and the muttered reassurance of a doctor preparing his oldest tools. This is the world of bloodletting and blistering, the stubbornly persistent treatments that refuse to die, even as Victorian science claimed to be modern. The theory was simple: too much blood equals sickness. The solution? Get rid of some. Doctors had been doing this since ancient times, and Victorians, who loved tradition wrapped in a new coat of science, happily continued. You picture yourself sitting in a stiff wooden chair, sleeve rolled up, as the doctor ties a band around your arm. He opens his case and pulls out a gleaming lancet, a small, sharp blade. With a quick flick, he slices the skin, and dark blood begins to flow into the waiting bowl. You probably wouldn't survive this cure for long, especially if your treatment was repeated weekly. Leeches, of course, still made appearances, squirming on necks and ankles, but blistering offered its own variety of torment. A blister plaster was a concoction of mustard, vinegar, or caustic chemicals spread on cloth and pressed against the skin. The idea was to raise a painful blister, then drain it, believing the body would redirect disease outward. You imagine lying in bed, chest covered in mustard paste until your skin burns raw. The doctor calls it progress. You call it misery. Mainstream fact: bloodletting remained common into the mid-19th century, even as evidence piled up against it. Some doctors bled pneumonia patients until they fainted. Others treated fevers by draining pint after pint. It wasn't until clinical statistics, those terrifying numbers, showed survival rates dropped with aggressive bleeding that the practice finally began to fade. Quirky tidbit: Victorian magazines sometimes printed recipes for at-home blister plasters. Housewives dutifully mixed mustard powder and flour, applied it to cloth, and slapped it onto their children's chests for coughs. Imagine being tucked in at night with not a teddy bear but a sizzling mustard poultice strapped across your ribs. Comforting, in its own scalding way. You wander further and pass a physician's study. On his desk sit neat rows of scarificators, brass boxes with spring-loaded blades that snapped out to slash multiple cuts at once. The sound, click, snap, slice, echoes in your ears. For the doctor, it was efficient. For the patient, it was a nightmare. Historians still argue whether many doctors knew they were clinging to a ritual rather than a cure. But habits die hard, especially when reinforced by centuries of practice. Blistering, meanwhile, wasn't just for colds. Some doctors applied blisters to the spine for paralysis, to the temples for headaches, even to the soles of feet for fevers. The theory of counter-irritation claimed that if you created a new wound, the body would abandon the old problem to focus on the fresh injury. It's the medical equivalent of distracting a toddler with a shiny toy while your house burns down. And yet, despite the absurdity, you notice how patients clung to these treatments. Diaries describe the relief of seeing sickness drawn out, as though the sight of blood or pus leaving the body proved healing was happening. It's not so different from modern people trusting in detox teas or magnetic bracelets. The ritual feels real, even when the science is shaky. You picture a wealthy Victorian household where the master of the house lies feverish in bed. The doctor arrives, calm and assured, and orders a blister plaster applied to the chest. The servants hurry to prepare it. Within hours, the man's skin is blistered raw, and yet everyone sighs with relief. Something has been done. Whether or not it helps, the ritual itself becomes medicine. Meanwhile, in poorer homes, bleeding and blistering were cheaper than fancy medicines. Families could apply their own mustard poultices or pay a barber surgeon a few pennies for a quick cut. You imagine a dingy tenement room, the smell of vinegar thick in the air, children whimpering as their mother rubs mustard paste onto their skin, praying it will quiet their coughs. Historians still debate how much harm these treatments caused. Some argue they merely weakened already fragile patients, nudging them closer to death. Others suggest occasional small bloodlettings may have relieved conditions like high blood pressure, but in an age before antibiotics, before vaccines, before true cures, the line between harm and help was often blurred. As you step back into the fog, you can almost hear the rhythm of Victorian medicine, the snip of a lancet, the slurp of a leech, the hiss of mustard poultice against inflamed skin. It's a soundtrack of desperation disguised as healing, and just like the corsets and opium bottles, it reveals a truth about the era. When science faltered, spectacle and ritual filled the gap. You step into a dim Victorian clinic where wires snake across the floor like restless serpents. The faint smell of singed wool lingers in the air, and the hush of anticipation is broken only by the sputtering crackle of an electrical coil sparking in the corner. Here, in this strange chamber, you witness the birth of a peculiar kind of therapy, the use of electricity to shock the human body back to health, or so they claim. Victorians are buzzing, quite literally, with the notion that jolts of current could cure everything from melancholia to impotence. You might raise an eyebrow, but remember, this was an age where science was still fumbling with matches in the dark, hoping to light the room without burning down the house. You take a seat near a brass contraption resembling a cross between a sewing machine and a miniature guillotine. This is the electrotherapy device, a proud invention touted in advertisements promising renewed vigour and miraculous recovery. Imagine men in stiff collars and women in petticoats sitting calmly, while physicians crank the handles and let the current course through their bodies. It's a sight both comical and unsettling, like watching someone try to charge their soul with the same enthusiasm you'd use to crank-start a lawnmower. The mainstream fact is simple. Electricity was barely understood, but it fascinated the Victorians endlessly. The era's medical journals brimmed with enthusiastic reports that patients claimed improved circulation, sharper thinking, even spiritual uplift after sessions of carefully measured shocks. The fact that much of this was placebo didn't stop practitioners from believing they had harnessed the very essence of life. Some even speculated that electricity was proof of divine energy itself. But then comes the fringe tidbit. Certain physicians went a step further, experimenting with applying current to cadavers in demonstrations that blurred the line between science and horror theatre. Crowds would gather as lifeless limbs twitched under electrical stimulation. There were gasps, laughter, and the occasional fainting spell from more delicate audience members. While these experiments didn't exactly raise the dead, they did spark wild rumours that electricity could reanimate the recently deceased. Historians still argue whether these shows were intended as genuine medical demonstrations or simply macabre entertainment dressed up as science. You lean back and picture a nervous patient gripping a pair of metal rods, wincing as the doctor turns a dial. The idea of electrical baths spreads, where entire bodies are immersed in mild currents while lounging in water. It's like a Victorian hot tub, but with the added risk of frying yourself if someone drops the wrong wire. And then there's electrospectacles, glasses wired with small currents that were supposed to improve eyesight. You try to imagine someone blinking rapidly under these jolts, muttering that their vision is clearer, or at least that they'll never forget the experience. The humour here writes itself. You wouldn't be wrong to think of it as the Victorian version of buying the newest gadget online just because it claims to fix all your problems. It's like those late-night infomercials where someone shouts that their product will melt fat, reduce stress, and make you breakfast. Except in this case, the breakfast is served with a side of mild electrocution. As you drift along in the story, you notice how electricity seemed to embody progress and danger in equal measure. Victorians loved the spectacle of it, the blue sparks dancing in the air, the glowing filaments, the sense that human life itself might be nothing more than a current waiting to be tapped. The medical community was divided, though some hailed it as the future of healing, others dismissed it as a dangerous fad. Scholars still debate whether electrotherapy had any measurable effect beyond placebo, or whether it was simply a cultural phenomenon reflecting society's obsession with industrial power. You picture yourself walking out of the clinic, still tingling from the imagined shocks, your footsteps lighter, perhaps from placebo, perhaps from genuine stimulation of your nerves. Either way, the session would leave you telling friends that you felt better, and maybe that's all that mattered. In the end, electrotherapy became a symbol of the era's strange blend of science, spectacle, and faith in progress. And as you drift further into the evening, you can't help but wonder, if electricity could make a corpse twitch, what else might it awaken? The room around you shifts again, and this time you're surrounded by glass jars filled with cloudy liquids, each labelled with delicate handwriting that curls like ivy across the paper tags. Welcome to the Victorian laboratory of animal magnetism, better known as mesmerism. The air smells faintly of lavender oil and candle wax, but beneath it all, there's an electric tension that has nothing to do with wires or machines. Instead, this is about invisible forces, about unseen currents believed to flow between bodies and minds. You watch as a man in a long coat, his hair slicked back with pomade, waves his hand slowly before the face of a patient reclining in a chair. His movements are deliberate, theatrical, almost hypnotic in themselves. This is the practice of Franz Mesmer's followers, who believed that illness arose from blockages in a mysterious fluid called animal magnetism. By making passes with their hands, sometimes aided by magnets or metal rods, practitioners claimed they could realign these subtle currents and restore harmony. The mainstream facts are clear. Mesmerism gained huge popularity in the 18th and 19th centuries, drawing crowds eager to see people collapse into trances or rise with renewed energy. Physicians debated whether these results were due to some hidden force or simply the power of suggestion. In fact, mesmerism would eventually pave the way for the study of hypnosis, which psychologists still use today in therapy. So while the mysterious magnetic fluids were never proven, the techniques reveal the human mind's extraordinary capacity for self-healing when belief is engaged. But the fringe tidbits are even more curious. In some salons, mesmerists would gather groups of patients around elaborate contraptions called bouquets, large tubs filled with water and iron filings, with rods sticking out for people to grasp. The room would be dimly lit, with soft music playing, and soon participants would begin to sigh, tremble, or even convulse as the magnetism supposedly coursed through them. Imagine a kind of group séance, but instead of summoning spirits, they claimed to summon health. Rumours spread that some women experienced magnetic ecstasies, which of course both scandalised and fascinated Victorian society. You chuckle softly at the image. Respectable citizens gripping iron rods and swooning in candlelit rooms, their neighbours fanning them while a mesmerist whispers about invisible forces swirling through the air. It's part medical treatment, part performance art, part social spectacle. For skeptics, it was nothing more than mass hysteria. For believers, it was proof that the universe itself vibrated with hidden energies waiting to be harnessed. Some fringe practitioners went further still, insisting they could control not only health but also thoughts. There are documented cases of mesmerists claiming they could implant ideas into the minds of subjects in deep trances. Picture a Victorian dinner party where the host boasts that he can make a guest believe they're a chicken simply by waving his hand. Laughter would ripple through the parlour as the unfortunate subject flapped their arms. Oblivious to the joke, skeptics called it manipulation, but believers whispered about the dawn of mind control. The humour isn't hard to find here either. You can think of mesmerism as the Victorian equivalent of those modern wellness fads that promise to balance your energy with crystals, sound baths, or detox teas. The science might be shaky, but the experience is often convincing enough that people walk away swearing it worked. And who can deny that belief itself can sometimes heal? As you linger in this world, you notice how mesmerism tapped into something deeper than medicine. It wasn't just about curing headaches or easing nerves, it was about giving people a sense of wonder, of belonging to a world filled with mysteries beyond the reach of ordinary science. To sit in a mesmerist's chair was to surrender, if only briefly, to the possibility that the universe was alive with currents invisible yet powerful. And so you leave the parlour, the scent of candle wax fading, the murmurs of entranced patients lingering in your ears. You walk into the night air with a strange mix of skepticism and curiosity. Did those hand passes do anything at all? Or was it simply the human mind reminding you of its remarkable power to shape your reality? Either way, mesmerism survives not in its old claims of invisible fluids, but in the recognition that belief itself can be one of the strongest medicines of all. The laboratory fades, and suddenly you find yourself standing in a dusty tent on the edge of a barren desert plain. The year is the late 1940s, and the air vibrates with tension. Military trucks rumble in the background, their tyres crunching over gravel, while spotlights sweep across the night sky. Ahead of you lies a test site where some of the strangest and most controversial science experiments of the modern era took place. The attempts to harness psychic powers for warfare. Yes, this is the world of government-funded telepathy and remote viewing, often whispered about under the umbrella of psychic espionage. It sounds like science fiction, but it's rooted in real programs that spanned decades. The mainstream facts go something like this. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union grew obsessed with the possibility that the human mind might be capable of extraordinary feats, mind reading, telekinesis, even seeing across space and time. The fear was simple. If the enemy developed psychic spies, they could penetrate secrets without ever setting foot in a building, and so millions of dollars were quietly funneled into research that tested whether such abilities could be trained, measured, or weaponized. You watch as a man sits quietly in a folding chair, his eyes closed, a notepad in his lap. Across the room, another man shows an unseen object to an officer, keeping it hidden from the subject. The subject furrows his brow, scribbles furiously, and then reveals a drawing. Something that looks oddly like the concealed object. The military officers exchange uneasy glances. Did he really see it in his mind? Or was it chance? This was the kind of moment that kept these programs alive. Never quite enough proof to satisfy hard science, but just strange enough to keep the funding flowing. The fringe tidbits are the most colourful. In one case, a psychic named Ingo Swann claimed he could describe the surface of Jupiter in detail before NASA's probes ever reached it. Details that later seemed eerily accurate. Another, Joseph McMoneagle, said he used remote viewing to locate hostages hidden in enemy territory. Skeptics argued these were nothing more than clever guesses or retroactive interpretations, but to believers, they hinted at the untapped potential of the human brain. And then there are the more absurd claims. Some experimenters insisted they could kill a goat with their minds, staring at it until it collapsed, an idea that inspired the satirical book and film The Men Who Stare at Goats. Others thought telekinesis might allow soldiers to bend spoons, jam enemy radar, or even disrupt electronics with nothing but focused willpower. You can almost laugh imagining a platoon of stern-faced soldiers squinting at kitchenware, trying to bend metal without touching it, while generals pace behind them taking notes. Yet for all the humour, the fascination is real. Imagine the military briefing rooms of the era, maps on the wall, cigarette smoke curling through the air, and a colonel leaning forward to ask a psychic, "Where is the missile silo?" For a moment, the boundaries between hard science, folklore, and desperation blur. In the shadows of the Cold War, almost anything seemed worth trying if it gave even the faintest edge over the enemy. As you stand in the tent, you feel the pull of two worlds again. On one side, the rigid skepticism of science demands replicable results, statistical significance, and evidence free of bias. On the other side lies the tantalizing idea that the human mind might hold powers far beyond what we understand. The tension between those two poles is what makes this story linger. You leave the tent, the desert air cool against your skin, stars sprawling across the endless sky. The soldiers fade into the distance, their experiments half science, half theatre, but always charged with the possibility that maybe, just maybe, There was more to the mind than neurons firing in the dark. You walk on, reflecting on how the strangest science often begins not with proof, but with questions too wild to ignore. The desert fades from view, replaced by a shadowed room lined with jars and glass beakers, all bubbling and steaming like something out of a Gothic novel. You've entered the laboratory of Victorian chemistry, where experimentation often danced on the edge of the absurd and sometimes the deadly. Here, alchemy hasn't disappeared, it's just wearing a white coat and wielding a Bunsen burner. Victorians believed chemical mixtures could cure, invigorate, or even transform the body. Mercury, for example, was a popular cure-all. You see it in small doses for syphilis, applied topically or ingested, despite its toxic nature. Patients often ended up sallow, trembling or hallucinating, yet they endured because a doctor's prescription carried authority. Historians still argue whether mercury treatments extended life in rare cases or mostly hastened decline, but people clung to hope in a shiny metal vial nonetheless. Quirky experiments litter this world. Chemists devised concoctions of arsenic-laced cosmetics, claiming it improved complexion while simultaneously poisoning users slowly enough to be tolerable. Hair dyes, whitening creams, even stomach elixirs sometimes carried this silent risk. Picture a Victorian lady dabbing her cheeks with a subtle glow of arsenic powder, feeling prettier and more fashionable even as her body protested in tiny invisible ways. Mainstream fact: some chemists also pursued genuine breakthroughs. Aspirin, widely used today, first gained traction in the late 19th century, and ether and chloroform emerged as anaesthetics, revolutionising surgery. So while some experiments were laughably dangerous, others laid the groundwork for modern medicine. The line between innovation and folly was remarkably thin. You wander toward a cluttered bench where bottles of coloured liquids shimmer under candlelight. Some fizz violently, producing clouds of pungent smoke. You're reminded of phlogiston theory, still taught in some circles despite being largely discredited, a Victorian version of clinging to old habits when new evidence arrives. You imagine students learning about invisible, fire-like substances, while the instructor mutters about reactions they can't yet explain. And then there are the more theatrical curiosities. One chemist allegedly attempted to create a perpetual glow serum by combining phosphorus and other compounds, claiming it could illuminate rooms without candles. The mixture was volatile, often bursting into flame unexpectedly, but for brief moments, it truly fascinated anyone watching the eerie green glow. You probably wouldn't survive handling it yourself, but it's mesmerising nonetheless. Victorians also experimented with gases in bizarre ways. Carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and hydrogen were tested not only for chemistry, but also for therapeutic effects. Laughing gas became popular at parties, then in dental offices, to dull pain, though some enthusiasts misused it for prolonged euphoric experiences. Historians still argue whether these experiments were ethical by today's standards, or whether they were reckless curiosity disguised as science. You pick up a vial of a bright blue liquid, its contents shimmering like captured lightning. The chemist assures you it can cure headaches, stomach troubles, or fainting spells. Perhaps it works, perhaps it doesn't. The charm lies in its promise, the ritual of administering, and the careful observation that feels almost like magic. Here, Victorian medicine is performance art as much as science, a delicate blend of observation, experiment, and a dash of theatre. By the time you step back into the foggy streets, your senses are tingling with the residue of chemicals and imagination. You realise how much Victorian science relied not just on what was known, but on what people believed, on the hope that a little mercury, a glowing serum, or a whiff of arsenic could bend nature toward human ends. It's intoxicating, dangerous, and oddly captivating, like stepping into a world where curiosity itself is the main ingredient. The street narrows now, and the smell of smoke and soot mixes with something sweeter. Camphor, turpentine, and the faint tang of opium. You realise you've wandered into a Victorian pharmacy, a place where potions, pills, and powders line every shelf like glittering treasures. But don't be fooled. What looks like a quaint shop of remedies is also a testament to some of the era's most bizarre and dangerous medical ideas. You run your fingers along glass bottles with labels like Elixir of Life, Dr. Brown's Nervous Tonic, and Opadeldoc for all ailments. These aren't just marketing gimmicks. Many Victorian medicines contained active ingredients: morphine, cocaine, arsenic, strychnine. People swallowed them believing in their curative power, unaware of the subtle poison lurking in every drop. Historians still debate how much harm these patent medicines caused versus how much they were actually effective for pain relief or temporary stimulation. Quirky detail: one tonic, advertised for women's delicate nerves, contained enough alcohol to knock over a modern adult. Another, meant to aid children's digestion, was laced with morphine, earning the grim nickname soothing syrup. You picture parents dosing their fussy infants, mistaking calm for cure, completely oblivious to the danger. Mainstream fact: pharmacists of the time were trained chemists, but regulation was minimal. There was no FDA to verify ingredients, measure doses, or test efficacy. The result? A wild west of medicine where anyone with a recipe in a bottle could claim miraculous results. Shops doubled as medical advice centres, with chemists dispensing guidance alongside hazardous potions. You notice a curious contraption in the corner, a vaporizer promising to purify the lungs of city dwellers. Patrons would sit in chairs, inhale fumes of camphor, eucalyptus, and sometimes ammonia, convinced that clearing the airways could prevent consumption, bronchitis, or simply improve vitality. You watch a young woman cough politely, trying to look reassured, while the fumes sting her eyes. It's part medical treatment, part theatre, and all Victorian. Then come the herbalists, blending dried plants with chemical additives. Willow bark, known for its mild, pain-relieving properties, gets mixed with spirits and other extracts, marketed as a panacea for everything from fever to melancholy. You might smile, thinking this sounds reasonable, until you spot the bottles labelled arsenical tonic or radium water. Yes, radium. People genuinely believed drinking a radioactive solution would energise the body and prevent illness. You probably won't survive that today, but back then it was science in the making, or unmaking. Some shopkeepers even offered live demonstrations, pulling out small animals or insects, dropping them into concoctions, and claiming they could detect toxins or cures through the creature's reactions. Imagine a parlour filled with patrons watching a mouse twitch in a vial, the chemist nodding solemnly. See, it approves. It's both charming and horrifying, a combination of spectacle, quackery, and experimental curiosity. Historians still argue whether these patent medicines were primarily exploitative or if they filled a genuine gap when licensed medical care was inaccessible. Likely, it was both. The public wanted relief, and entrepreneurs were eager to supply it, regardless of the cost. As you leave the pharmacy, the smell of opium and chemicals clinging to your coat, you realise how Victorian medicine thrived on hope, spectacle, and the occasional dash of danger. People willingly embraced strange potions, trusting in the promise of wellness even when science had yet to catch up. And somehow, that audacious curiosity, however reckless, keeps drawing you forward into the next shadowy corner of their world. You step out of the pharmacy, the fog curling around your ankles like a living thing, and soon find yourself in a large lecture hall. Gaslights flicker over rows of eager students and physicians in training, all focused on a central demonstration table. Here, you're about to witness one of the strangest yet celebrated aspects of Victorian medical pedagogy: public vivisection and an anatomical demonstration. Mainstream fact: the Victorians placed enormous value on hands-on observation. Anatomy textbooks were useful, but nothing replaced the live demonstration of physiology. Medical schools would often host public dissections to teach both students and the general public about human biology, disease, and surgical technique. You imagine the crisp, cold air of the hall, the smell of formaldehyde and ether, and the careful precision of the lecturer, scalpel in hand, explaining each muscle, nerve, and organ with calm authority. Historians still debate whether these demonstrations were necessary, or if they catered as much to spectacle as education. Quirky tidbit. Some lecturers would go a step further, using light, mirrors, and even early photography to project images of the dissection to the entire hall. Imagine the first slide shows flickering candlelight over the exposed layers of tissue, while students take notes with trembling hands. Occasionally, a patient's body or an animal substitute would twitch unexpectedly, prompting gasps, nervous laughter, or dramatic sighs from the audience. You shiver at the thought of sitting among them, notebook in hand, trying to appear composed. The obsession with hands-on experience extended beyond humans. Animals were often used for experiments in physiology, anesthesia, and pharmacology. Dogs, rabbits, and even monkeys were subjects in studies of blood flow, nerve function, and drug effects. Victorian journals proudly reported their findings: the twitching leg, the accelerated pulse, or the convulsion under a new anaesthetic. For modern eyes, it seems cruel. Yet the knowledge gained laid foundations for today's surgical techniques and anaesthetic protocols. You watch a student approach the table nervously, his scalpel gleaming under the gaslight. The lecturer speaks in a calm, almost hypnotic tone, explaining that understanding the human body requires both courage and detachment. For a moment, you imagine stepping forward and lifting the scalpel yourself, heart pounding, hands trembling, not just learning anatomy, but confronting mortality directly. And then there's the theatrical side. Some lecturers became almost performers, adding dramatic flourishes, gestures, or even light humour to the proceedings. One report describes a professor pausing mid-dissection to joke about the muscles being stiffer than my father-in-law at Sunday dinner. The students laugh nervously, but the lesson sticks. The human body is intricate, alive, and terrifyingly delicate. Fringe practices sometimes overlapped with superstition. Certain practitioners believed that observing the heart's last beat, or the twitch of a nerve, could reveal hidden truths about life energy, character, or moral disposition. This vitalist thinking blended with scientific curiosity, producing a hybrid of meticulous study and Victorian mysticism. You probably won't survive believing that one twitch can reveal your soul, but for them, it was serious business. As you leave the lecture hall, the scent of chemicals fading behind you, you sense the duality of Victorian science, a world where knowledge and spectacle intertwine, curiosity and discomfort coexist, and each discovery is edged with both wonder and unease. You step back into the foggy streets, carrying with you the memory of flickering gaslights, nervous students, and the raw, almost intimate confrontation with life itself. The fog thins slightly as you wander into a quiet courtyard where the faint scent of herbs mingles with a sharp tang of chemical reagents. Here, in the shadows of a greenhouse and laboratory hybrid, Victorian scientists conduct botanical experiments that blur the line between medicine, chemistry, and superstition. Welcome to the world of experimental pharmacognosy, where plants are tested for their potential to heal, harm, or produce curious physiological effects. Mainstream fact, Victorians were fascinated by the therapeutic potential of plants. Digitalis, derived from foxglove, was used to treat heart conditions. Quinine, extracted from cinchona bark, combated malaria. Herbal knowledge from centuries past was integrated into scientific study, leading to a blend of empirical research and traditional remedies. Patients relied on these treatments for everything from fever to fatigue, trusting that nature contained hidden powers waiting to be unlocked. Historians still argue whether botanical medicine advanced science or merely prolonged reliance on untested remedies. But then there's the quirky side. Some botanists experimented with the psychotropic potential of plants, often under the guise of medicinal research. Seeds, roots, and flowers from exotic locations were tested for effects on mood, perception, and even dreams. You imagine a young researcher nibbling at leaves or inhaling vapours, documenting sensations as if writing a diary of hallucinations. The results were unpredictable. Some participants found relief, others panic, and a few claimed mystical visions. You notice jars labelled belladonna, henbane, and mandrake. These plants were highly toxic, yet small doses were believed to calm nerves, relieve pain, or treat a variety of ailments. Women sometimes applied belladonna-infused salves to dilate pupils for cosmetic effect, a practice both fashionable and perilous. You imagine the sparkle in their eyes, unaware of the latent danger lingering in those alluring drops. Fringe experiments went even further. Certain laboratories tested combinations of plant extracts with animal fluids or chemical additives, seeking to create panaceas or universal remedies. Imagine the smell, pungent, bitter, a mixture of herbs and formaldehyde. Students and assistants would record results meticulously, noting tremors, euphoria, or pallor, convinced that each observation brought them closer to a miraculous cure. Victorians also believed that plants could influence personality. Hellebore was thought to cool excessive ambition, while valerian supposedly calmed irritability. Gardeners and doctors alike embraced the notion that arranging flowers or prescribing teas could subtly nudge temperament. Quirky but sincere, it reflects the era's conviction that health, mind, and environment were intimately intertwined. You stroll past a table of seedlings under gaslight, watching droplets of water glinting like tiny stars. The scientists adjust glass tubes, drip solutions, and annotate reactions. Each plant is both a subject and a teacher, its leaves revealing secrets about life, chemistry, and the fragile balance between safety and danger. Historians still argue whether these botanical experiments yielded genuine medical breakthroughs or mostly served as elaborate exercises in curiosity. Yet one fact remains. Victorian fascination with plants helped establish pharmacology as a science, blending observation, experimentation, and the occasional leap of imagination. You leave the greenhouse with a sense of reverence, tinged with unease, aware that even the most beautiful flower could conceal deadly potential or miraculous power within its leaves. The night air grows colder as you step into a large, dimly lit chamber filled with strange contraptions that clatter and hiss, reminiscent of both a mad scientist's dream and a carnival gone wrong. You've entered the world of Victorian medical devices, a realm where inventiveness and curiosity collided with desperation, producing some of the era's most bizarre treatments. Here, science is mechanical, chemical, and occasionally absurd, all aimed at curing ailments that medicine still barely understood. Mainstream fact: many of these devices were designed with a sincere belief in their efficacy. Pulley systems, counterweights, and early traction chairs were used to treat spinal deformities or joint problems. Steam baths, pneumatic machines, and vibrating beds were applied to ease muscular tension or stimulate circulation. Victorian engineers believed that if the body could be manipulated mechanically, illness could be corrected. Some methods worked partially, others caused more discomfort than cure. Historians still debate the effectiveness versus the theatricality of these interventions. Quirky detail. Consider the electric belt, a leather contraption lined with coils that claim to restore vitality, boost fertility, and even improve digestion through direct electrical stimulation. Men wore them under waistcoats. Women occasionally braved similarly bizarre apparatuses. Imagine strapping yourself into such a device in hopes of improving your constitution, only to find yourself buzzing like a poorly wired telephone. You can't help but smile at the thought. though the contemporary users were often entirely serious. Some devices were built for comfort, or at least the illusion of comfort. Mechanical baths would gently rock patients, pneumatic chairs would supposedly massage organs internally, and vibrating beds claimed to stimulate energy flow. Yet behind the promise often lay crude engineering, exposed gears, and unpredictable results. Patients might leave feeling refreshed, mildly bruised, or just thoroughly bewildered. Fringe devices included skull crushers for headaches, spring-loaded foot stretchers for flattening corns, and contraptions claiming to correct posture while simultaneously toning muscles. Certain inventors even marketed machines designed to cure mental ailments, combining vibration, heat, and pressure in configurations that would make your modern chiropractor wince. Imagine reclining while gears grind, springs bounce, and steam hisses. A strange symphony of pseudotherapy. Humour surfaces naturally. You might picture a Victorian gentleman in full evening attire, sitting in a traction chair, top hat askew, trying to appear composed as levers and pulleys tug at his spine, or a lady of society using a vibrating belt under her corset, hoping to maintain poise and health while secretly wincing with every oscillation. The line between genuine treatment and theatrical absurdity was delightfully thin, yet beneath the spectacle, there was method and curiosity. Engineers and doctors observed reactions carefully, kept meticulous notes, and sought patterns, even if the theories behind them were sometimes misguided. These devices, however strange, reflect the era's commitment to experimentation and belief that science, even mechanical, could manipulate the human body for better health. As you exit the chamber, the clanking of gears fading behind you, you feel the essence of Victorian medicine in your bones, a blend of hope, danger, spectacle, and relentless curiosity. Every contraption, every bizarre treatment, every eccentric experiment is a testament to a time when the boundaries of science were still being drawn, sometimes precisely, often wildly, and always with human lives at the centre. You emerge into the quiet of a Victorian night, gas lamps casting long shadows across cobblestone streets, the fog curling around your ankles as if reluctant to let you leave. The world you've traversed, the asylums, laboratories, pharmacies, lecture halls, and greenhouse experiments, feels both distant and immediate. A tapestry of curiosity, danger, and unbridled imagination. Here, in the final stretch, you reflect on the odd symphony of Victorian medicine, a place where hope often outpaced knowledge, and spectacle often masqueraded as science. You notice the residual smell of chemicals, the faint metallic tang of blood, and the lingering scent of herbs from the botanical experiments. It's comforting, in a strange way, that human ingenuity and desperation share the same air. Mainstream fact, Victorian medicine was a product of its time, constrained by limited understanding but driven by remarkable curiosity. Procedures, devices, and remedies were often risky, yet they laid crucial foundations for modern medicine. From antiseptic techniques to anesthesia, from early pharmacology to clinical observation, historians still argue how much suffering was truly necessary versus how much was the byproduct of clinging to tradition. Quirky tidbit, some treatments, though bizarre, sparked curiosity that led to legitimate breakthroughs. Leeches, for example, while largely unnecessary, inspired careful study of bloodletting and circulation. Opium, despite its dangers, initiated the exploration of analgesics and narcotics. Even the whimsical electric belts and vibrating contraptions helped people understand the limits of physiology, pain tolerance, and human psychology. You remember the lessons of mesmerism, with its hand passes and trance-like states, and how they revealed the mind's susceptibility to suggestion. You recall the patent medicines, potions laced with morphine, cocaine, or arsenic, and the public's willingness to trust these in the absence of regulation. You think of public dissections, the spectacle of knowledge, and the merging of theatre and science. Each vignette has taught you something, that science, like humanity, is an evolving experiment. As your journey slows, you notice the patterns emerging, curiosity entwined with desperation, spectacle entwined with earnestness, hope entwined with peril. You might smile at the absurdity, shudder at the danger, or marvel at the innovation. But most importantly, you realize how far we've come while acknowledging that science was, and always is, a human endeavour, complete with mistakes, triumphs, and eccentricities. Take a deep breath, letting the fog of history settle softly around you. You've walked through laboratories where chemicals hissed, lecture halls where cadavers taught lessons, and pharmacies where potions promised impossible cures. The night is calm now, the streets silent, and the strange symphony of Victorian medicine becomes a whisper, fading into memory. In that quiet, you can almost sense the curiosity and courage of those who pushed boundaries, dared experiments, and pursued healing, even when understanding lagged behind intention. As your mind drifts, imagine the streets empty, the lamps glowing softly, and every unusual experiment, every bizarre treatment, slowly dissolving into the gentle hum of history. Let the fog and gaslight carry you towards sleep, leaving behind the echoes of eccentricity, ingenuity, and relentless curiosity. Your word count 1 to 86. Wind down 300 words. Now, as the fog of Victorian streets fades, let your breathing slow and soften. Imagine yourself reclining in a comfortable chair, the gas lamps dimmed to a gentle glow, your body supported, your mind finally still. The streets, laboratories, and lecture halls you visited dissolve into memory, leaving only a sense of quiet fascination, the buzz of electricity, the hiss of chemical reactions, the flicker of candlelight. They all fade, settling into the background of your imagination like a distant lullaby. Think of the strange remedies and devices, the leeches, the blister plasters, the patent medicines. They no longer threaten you. Instead, they exist as whispers of a time when curiosity and courage danced hand in hand, when humanity sought understanding even through missteps. Let your thoughts drift through the foggy streets one last time, feeling the soft rhythm of history pulse in your mind, gentle and persistent. Allow the sensation of wonder to mingle with calm. Every bizarre experiment, every whimsical contraption, every mysterious plant, and every odd practice is now a story tucked safely into your memory. The excitement of discovery and the warmth of human ingenuity linger softly, transforming curiosity into a gentle hum that soothes rather than startles. With every breath, let the eerie, fascinating, and occasionally absurd images of Victorian medicine fade, replaced by a comforting silence. The fog curls one last time, the lamps glow softly, and the streets are empty. You're safe. You're still. You're ready to drift. Now, dim the lights. Let the hum of the evening carry you, and feel the gentle weight of sleep settling in. The world of strange science remains, waiting quietly for another night, while you rest, secure in the calm and curiosity of what you've seen.